Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming out today. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd just like to remind everyone, if you are a member of Abertay Historical Society, you can collect your copy of our shiny new book, Dundee Miscellany, which is hot off the press. So if you've not got your copy yet, please do get that on your way out after the talk. And this evening I am really looking forward to hearing Jane Anderson speaking about Duchess Katharine, born a Ramsay of Banff in Alyth, who studied music before marrying into the Atholl family. And she was elected Scotland's first woman MP in 1923, so this marks her centenary of that election. And it sounds like she has a really interesting political career as well. So tonight we'll be hearing about her from Jane Anderson, the former archivist of Atholl Estates for 35 years.
Thank you very much for asking me to come and speak about the Duchess. It's been a week of the Duchess because her election as Scotland's first woman MP was on the 6th of December. So she was a groundbreaking person for many reasons, not just her election as the woman MP, but for her conduct thereafter. And it was also in December that her tenure as MP came to an end in quite controversial circumstances. So she was born, as has been said, at Banff House in Alyth. Is it loud enough? Yeah. She was part of quite a large family, and the interesting thing about the family was that her father, who was something of a scholar himself, believed that the daughters of the house should be as well educated as his sons. And this really set the tone for a lot of her life. She was the eldest daughter of a second marriage. She had older sisters and younger brothers, so she was sort of the one sandwiched in between. She was brought up at Banff and probably tutored by the older sisters for a while. She then went to Wimbledon High School, and she later wrote the school song. Her music interest developed as well as her academic ones, and she went to the Royal College of Music, studying piano and composition. She obviously really enjoyed that and had almost felt that that was her life's work. But she was also part of the social scene in Perthshire. Her mother, probably more than her father, she was a talented musician in her own right. And when they went round country houses for visits, they would play and sing to their audience. They were invited to Blair Castle, which Kitty was not very enthusiastic about. She thought that they would be very formal, and maybe she was missing her studies and the seriousness of discussion at Banff. So she took music, books and a bicycle and cycled up from the station. However, over the weekend, she obviously had enough conversation with her host son, the Marquis of Tullibardine, later 8th Duke of Atholl, to maybe revise her opinion of the family. Said she returned with the scores of music unopened, the books unread and the bicycle unused for fleeing from the family. She took walks with Bardi and chatted away, holding her own, not really daunted by the fact that he was an eligible catch. I don't think that thought had entered her mind. But they obviously, an unlikely pair, because Bardi showed no studiousness at all and had to retake his army exams a number of times. But they got on, as often people do in life. They started writing to each other and became increasingly affectionate. However, Bardi's career as a soldier was important to him, And he was at the point of going and serving in the Sudan with Kitchener. And Kitchener wouldn't take men with any attachments because it felt they diverted him from the job. So their understanding between Kitty and Bardi was kept secret. More letters passed between them. Neither family was in any way pleased about this. The Duke had hoped for his heir to marry a very wealthy person because they weren't really that well off, even though they were dukes. And marrying somebody that was poorer than his son was obviously not what he thought a good match. Strangely enough, the Ramsay family were also not pleased. Kitty's father was on the more liberal side of politics and really disliked the idea of his daughter marrying into the landed class, even though he did own Banff. This didn't seem to really have crossed his mind, that there was an element of similarity, though not of scale. And he would much rather have had a more serious son-in-law as prospect. So neither received any encouragement, but they were both pretty headstrong and determined. And when they both got together, that was double the amount of determination. So they had their understanding, and when Bardi returned from the Sudan, an engagement was announced. Whether that was fully consented to or not, but once it was announced, well, the families had to consent to it. They were then married in 1899. And almost immediately, Bardi again had to go off soldier to the South Africa War. Fairly typically, he wrote to Kitty saying nothing much was really happening. He was sure the war would be over pretty soon, and why didn't she come and join him? Well, the war had actually hardly started at that point, but she duly set off for South Africa, and Bardi was serving with the Scottish Horse, the regiment he and his father had raised. So Kitty made herself useful, writing home for the men, helping those that were injured. She tried sort of going around with Bardi, but it was pretty soon made clear that the war was very definitely underway, and operations and battles did not really need to include a woman. So she spent most of the time at Johannesburg, but tried to make herself as useful as possible. When they returned after the war, her academic training came to the fore. She was not just going to sit around being a pretty bride for the Duke's son. She wrote the Perthshire Military History, which is a multi-volume history going back through all the conflicts from the medieval period onward of Perthshire, finishing up with the second volume on the South Africa War and pictures of all the men that fought. Some of it she edited from other people, and some of it she wrote herself. But it's a pretty big, substantial piece of work in a couple of years, returning to Perthshire newly married. So she achieved that, and she started to be involved in local, not exactly political things, but sort of educational committee type work. She strongly opposed women's suffrage, which is maybe ironic given in view of her later career, but she felt that women needed to have experience in public life, otherwise men would brush them aside. And she set about getting her experience. She served on an education committee for travelling people, and probably most substantially on the medical committee for the Highlands and Islands, which travelled extensively, viewing the very substandard conditions that doctors worked in the Highlands and Islands, and making recommendations about their housing, payment, holidays, and so forth. So she was really kept quite busy during this time before the Second World War. Obviously, people normally would have expected a prospective duchess just to socialise, join in the social round. But when you see that she'd written a book and sat on all these committees, there was probably very little of her time spent like that. By 1914, Bardi again was off on the soldiering front. The Scottish Horse were one of those who landed at Gallipoli, and one all knows what a disaster that was for everybody concerned. They were quickly evacuated. Not that Bardi thought it was a disaster, he actually thought it was great fun. But most of the people that were under fire on Gallipoli would not really have described it that way. So they were evacuated from there to Egypt, when again he suggested, since nothing really much was happening, that Kitty should join him. And again, she tried to make herself useful in Egypt, writing letters, performing concerts for the men that were there. The Scottish Horse was then combined with the Black Watch Regiment, and Bardi relieved of its individual command. So they returned home, luckily just in enough time for Bardi to see the end days of his father. He was ill, and Bardi was there when he died in 1917. So Kitty became a duchess. Bardi became the one responsible for the whole of the Atholl estates, which at that point ran to about 300,000 acres of North Perthshire. The main problem of which was that it was virtually bankrupt, and that really settled Bardi's course for the next few years. He tried to find ways of producing money to run the estate. He had a perfect knack of choosing the most perfect schemes to lose money, which he did regularly right throughout the 20s. He set up the Atholl steel houses, which was using surplus steel to keep people employed to produce houses for people that needed them. It expanded rapidly, was very successful, but then he expanded into France and Romania, where there was no exchange rate agreement with Britain, so he was never paid. He also set up an Anglo-Argentine tramway company, the Jamaica Sugar Corporation, and the electrification of Egypt project to heighten the Aswan Dam, all of which lost substantial amounts of money. While he was doing that, Kitty had been invited to become the Conservative candidate for West Perthshire. By now, she probably felt she had acquired enough experience in public life, and she duly accepted. And she was narrowly elected on the 6th of December 1923, just by 150 votes. Bardi was really supportive of her, and it's a significant feature of her whole career that she had an incredibly supportive husband. Some of his family were a wee bit more dubious about the Duchess really being most of the time in London and as an MP. She was only one of only 6 MPs when she was elected at that election, of women MPs. She was then made minister in the Department of Education, so she was the first Conservative woman minister. And she there came across another aristocrat, Eustace Percy, son of the Duke of Northumberland, who obviously wasn't quite as enlightened as Bardi, and really did not take to having his second as a woman, and sent her off to open schools all the way around the country rather than actually getting involved in the policy work. However, she did keep an eye on things and went to Baldwin when she felt that something was amiss. So obviously didn't endear her to the boss, Eustace Percy, but if he wasn't listening to her, she was jolly well going to make sure that what needed to be heard was heard at the highest levels. And it was. And so she actually and Bardi became good friends with Baldwin. So she carried on during the 20s, making her presence felt, but also being as agreeable as she could. And I think she quite genuinely enjoyed going around the schools that she had to open, meeting sometimes the girls, if they were girls' schools, but also all the variety of scholars right throughout the country. And there's a huge collection of keys at Blair Atholl, because when she opened the school, she was given a presentation key, and there's a whole case of them. So you can definitely see that she was kept pretty busy with that. When the Conservative government went out of office in 1929, she returned to the backbenches. She wrote Women in Politics, and trying to encourage other women to take a part. It's an odd read nowadays, but things date. But she was trying to be encouraging. It comes across as a bit didactic, but that's how things change. And she started taking note of more foreign policy. First of all, she wrote Conscription of the People about the Stalin labour camps, because she got into this by looking at timber dumping, which obviously relates to her Perthshire constituency. And a lot of Russian timber was coming in very cheap, and this led her to start investigating what was happening in Russia and how they could produce the timber so cheaply. And then she did a lot of reading of official reports, meeting of people, and really wanted to expose the conditions that workers were under in Russia at that time. This obviously didn't go down badly with the Conservative Party. This was fine. Her next part of her foreign investigations, though, was much more contentious. Probably one of the most controversial issues in the early 30s was the possibility of Indian independence. There was a lot of pressure towards that, and Kitty started to investigate. And it's interesting and very typical of her that she writes that she did nothing but read about it for 6 months before she spoke on it in the House of Commons. And when she did speak on the topics, she tried to be as dispassionate as possible. How things are very different now. I doubt our MPs would study something for 6 months and speak dispassionately on issues. But that was those two things, to become informed factually and to try and communicate it clearly, were her two key things. Her steady output of books, backed up by many pamphlets and correspondence, shows that she really wanted to get the facts before she spoke. She was very worried about the situation in India. It was obviously made out that she and a few others were very trying to be repressive of the indigenous peoples in India, but she could see that there were many divisions, and she could see especially that the culture there was very detrimental to women taking a full part in the affairs of the nation, or even being able to be fully educated. So she decided that she would vote against the government of the Conservative proposals, and she resigned the whip at that point in 1935 to do so. So the party were obviously starting to feel quite restive about her. It was a fairly short-lived rebellion in actual fact, because with the rise of Mussolini there was a crisis in Abyssinia, and she felt that was closer to home, and the rise of fascism in Europe was actually probably becoming more of an important issue, and she resumed the government whip again quite shortly afterwards to vote with them on the Abyssinian crisis. But that started being made. I think once people start to rebel and start to look behind issues, it stays with them. And she was starting to look throughout Europe at this rise of fascism. She read Mein Kampf in the original German edition and realised that the published British one left out all the threatening bits. How that had actually managed to happen, I'm not quite sure, but she arranged for the full version to be published and for it to be given to members of the government. It does seem that a lot of them didn't actually read it, which is perhaps unsurprising. So she was getting very worried about the ideas coming out of Germany. And in 1936, she also realised there were to be problems in Spain. Here there was an elected Republican government and an insurgency from Franco and the fascist troops. They were heavily supported from Italy and Germany. There was an international policy of non-intervention, no weapons to either side, which was a slight problem when one side just ignored it. And of course, Hitler and Mussolini went ahead and ignored it and armed Franco, but all the other countries, the democratic countries, abided by the non-intervention pact, so the elected government received no arms, or very few. She went out to Spain to look at the situation for herself. She decided that just hearing about it wasn't enough and maybe the true facts weren't coming out. So with a cross-party group of women, Ellen Wilkinson and Eleanor Rathbone, she travelled to Italy, to the areas under bombardment. And so the contacts she made there, she could very clearly assert that after the bombing of Guernica, that it was done by German bombers, whereas what the official line was that the government troops had mined it themselves before retreating and that there was no outside involvement. But she was able to strongly refute that. Her local party were now getting quite restive. They really wanted someone that would concentrate on affairs in Perthshire, not all this gadding around half of Europe. They were bothered about agricultural prices and such like that were of immediate effect to them. And so various people in the constituency organisation were really making quite a lot of stirring in the background to start with. And after her visit to Spain, they put to the committee that they should elect someone else for the next election, that they should choose an alternative candidate and not support her. Kitty was actually quite unbothered about this because I think she felt that by the time another election would be round, that the situation in Europe would be really very clear and that she would be vindicated and that really they could go ahead and do what they wanted for the next election as long as she was going to go on speaking. A lot of the coverage this week has, due to the journalist Elizabeth Quigley, during this week of events about the Duchess, have been about Spanish children. She got 4,000 people, 4,000 children out of Spain in the space of a few weeks because they were under fire and at the north of the country, in the Basque country, and getting pushed further and further into a vulnerable position. And she managed to organise a ship for their evacuation and bringing to Britain, where some of their descendants have remained to this day. And they obviously couldn't go back during the war, and then the years of the Second World War, they stayed here, and then the older ones had made a life here. So if they'd come as children of perhaps 10, they would be 20 and working, have relationships. So some of them remain here to this day and remember strongly their parents talking about what the Duchess did for them. So as the time progressed, Spain slipped off the horizon and Germany came to the fore. By now, the Duchess's conduct had not only raised problems locally, but also with the national government. And in April 1938, the government withdrew the whip from her. She had written asking them for assurances that they would support various things, so they didn't wait this time for her to withdraw the whip when they couldn't match her expectations, and they took the whip from her. This really was then almost the last straw for the local association, and at one of their meetings they decided to act with more urgency to find an alternative candidate rather than just saying for the next election. Kitty felt that she could no longer, with integrity, continue as an MP for a constituency that was looking to replace her, and as an MP for a government that had withdrawn the whip from her. So she resigned and fought a by-election. She wanted to stand as an independent, warning of the dangers that she felt were coming. The Conservative Party put forward a candidate against her, and they campaigned throughout the constituency. Obviously, the Conservative candidate had all the election returns, the agents, the cars and speakers from the National Party at his disposal. The Duchess had people just from a wide variety of life, not Conservatives, not mostly local, though a previous Liberal who had stood against her saw how important these issues of national security were and did help her. But when it came to the standing, the Liberal person, the candidate, the current candidate, did withdraw but did not endorse her. So most of the Liberals, who were the main opposition at that point, didn't actually support her. They didn't sort of take it as a political point that they could knock the government by supporting her. They weren't that politically tactical voting hadn't quite arrived in Perthshire at that point. So they kept away. A lot of the more ordinary people would have really struggled on that day. So this election, again, was in December, but it was on the 21st of December. It was a day of heavy snow, winds, frozen roads, and obviously a lot of people in those days had no means of going to polling stations if they weren't conveyed by the government cars, and Kitty only had a limited number available to her. So some of them would be facing walks of several miles to polling stations. So although she felt reasonably confident, she actually lost by 1,300 votes, just over 1,300 votes against the official candidate. One of the most telling reasons she felt was so many people had listened to to Chamberlain's coming back from Munich with "Peace in Our Time," that piece of paper that he waved, "Peace in Our Time." And she could understand that because it's not long after the First War. Everybody still would have known people, sons, brothers, fathers, who had been killed or maimed in the First War. And to hear somebody saying, "We must rearm, we must face this threat," sounded just too much for them at that point. They wanted to hear "Peace in Our Time," and they couldn't see that that meant capitulation to Hitler. And her trying to raise the issue that Hitler was a threat that had to try and be curtailed, even though it probably wouldn't have been successful, just didn't resonate. And so many people, even her supporters from before, probably abstained, and she felt that was the main issue, actually, rather than the fact that the government was against her. It was this fact that people wanted to hear "Peace in Our Time." So she lost, but she had been one of the very few to stand up and say that. The more obvious people who came to the fore, the more obvious anti-appeasers, Boothby in Scotland, Churchill, they sent her messages of encouragement, but they wouldn't come and speak for her. They didn't risk putting their heads above the parapets at that point. And again, maybe that's politics. Maybe she was not a good politician because she went for it. She felt she could not with integrity keep silent. These people managed to keep silent at that point, but were there when their chance came to rise up and become higher politicians. It's a difficult one. People make their judgments. People maybe felt that she was being naive by going for it, but she felt that she had to raise awareness of it and maintain her integrity. she didn't appear to greatly regret it. She felt she had done the best she could. She couldn't do any more. And with the onset of war, within a year, it was very obvious that she was right. Nobody ever came back and said that, but she had done the best she could. And with Bardi now aging and becoming ill, she was actually there for him during the early war years. He died in 1942. So for those few years, probably for the first time in their marriage, they were together, because for most of it, she had been in Parliament, he had been pursuing these business interests throughout the world. So it was almost a time of more peace and quiet for her, having done her best, and she was able to have a short period of calm and more domestic life. After the war, she maintained her contacts with many people throughout Europe, seeing the injustices that went on, people that were refugees on the turmoil of the post-war Europe, entertaining them, giving them sustenance or house room at times. They turned up at her house at Eastwood on the banks of the Tay, and some of them stayed there with her for a while and went on to other things. So she didn't cut herself off completely, but from active politics, that was the end of that by-election, was it as far as she was concerned. But she had certainly been a trailblazer. She had been very straight and very forthright, and she had used her education to write and try and convince people of the facts. And it is an attitude that I think today could still be useful. Thank you. Any questions? Oh, sorry, you're
Thank
next
you
to ask.
very much. No, that was really, really interesting. And yeah, I kept sort of thinking, oh no, I have heard her in that context, but I hadn't put it all, together in my head. That she really was quite a remarkable woman. Do we have any questions from the audience?
That was really interesting, and particularly a political journey from being a sort of straightforward Tory MP, apparently, to the involvement in the anti-fascist movement. Could you say a bit more about that? And was she ever drawn towards or connected to Labour politicians or socialists?
She was connected to them personally because she felt she should work for a cause in a cross-party way, and with Ellen Wilkinson in Spain, and probably especially Eleanor Rathbone. The most sort of cross-party and supportive thing, it was always with other women, actually, but maybe that's because they were more ready to be cross-party as well. The issue that she raised that was one of the most contentious was female genital mutilation, which, as something to raise in the Parliament in the 1930s, was probably a bit unusual. But she had, with her studies, found that this went on in what's then the colonies and under British rule. So she felt it was quite straightforward for the government to try and influence this and outlaw it in the colonies. And she spoke on that and was absolutely held down in Parliament. And it was with Ellen Wilkinson especially, who was obviously a very fierce Labour politician, who absolutely stood up for her and shouted to put the shame when the men were trying to heckle the Duchess and be sort of laddish about the topic. So that's just like one episode. She did not become Labour or socialist in any way at all. She got this nickname from her party, the Red Duchess. And that was merely because she supported the lawfully elected government in Spain, which happened to be a very left-wing Republican mixture of communist, anarchist, socialist people. So she was berated as the Red Duchess, which she most certainly wasn't. And one of the people on her constituency council said on that 1937 meeting that she had been present at a meeting where the red flag was sung. It was a Spanish fundraiser for the children. And she said, I was able to say that I couldn't have done that. I don't know the music. I could never have sung the red flag. So I don't know if she was taking that stand on a musical point rather than anything else. But she didn't. She saw her support as because it was factually correct, not because it was political. She supported the Republican government because it was the elected government, and the policy of non-intervention was to their detriment, and it shouldn't have been because the fascists were ignoring non-intervention. It wasn't that she supported a socialist cause per se. It was because of the injustice of how the non-intervention worked.
Do we have any other questions?
It's not so much about a question about the Duchess itself. What was the electoral franchise in the 20s?
When her first election, it was not a full franchise to 18. It was, I don't know, but something like 25 for women.
I think it was older.
Was it even more?
I think that was married. That was 30 or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was 30, aye.
Right.
It wasn't until the later 20s it came down to 21 for everyone.
Thank you. I've been eyeing you up saying what are you going to do, you've been useful. Right, so yeah, definitely she was not elected on a full franchise, but that was her, because a lot of people have, during this week even, have said, oh, you know, she's an enigmatic and contradictory feature. But it's not. She was very clear that the reason she didn't just change to supporting women's suffrage for no reason. She felt that when it was first mooted, well, you saw her reception she got when she did get to Parliament, and that was with experience. So she felt that women going into that had to be really experienced, well-informed, and used to that life before they should take up a role that they could then be criticised in if they didn't perform. Harsh.
Did they have any family in those
No, they didn't. And again, this is one of the issues that's sort of raised, is that why she did what she did? And you don't know. You've no idea, basically. In Sheila Hetherington's book, she's managed to find enough to suggest that she did attempt to have medical intervention when they couldn't have children. So the main time would have been when she first came back from the Boer War in those years, in the early years of the century. And she did visit various doctors. But in those days, obviously, medical intervention on that front was pretty limited. And it was limited to the woman, apart from anything else. So there's only a 50% chance of correcting any problems. But it's difficult to know that if she had had those years having a large family, as women would if they could have, probably, whether things would have been different or whether she would have had a family and then still gone on to it. You just don't know. And you don't know how much that affected what she wanted to do, really.
Was her husband a member of the House of Lords, and is that not exceptional for a married couple to be hold positions in both houses?
Gosh, I wouldn't know. I need another political scientist to know whether whether there are other ones, other aristocrats. There weren't very many women in Parliament, so I don't think there were any other aristocrats. So yeah, I think certainly for the 20s and 30s while she was there, it would be unusual. If anyone can think of any, that's fine, but I can't offhand. Because there was a preponderance, although the first few women, the first woman was an IRA woman, Countess Markovic, who didn't take a seat, and then Nancy Astor, who was Conservative. But then after that, there was a lot of more of Labour women. So I doubt there would be another in the Lords and in Commons.
I can't think of any examples of that.
No.
That it's mentioned.
He really stopped his political life when he became Duke. He didn't take any big part of that. He'd got enough to do, I think. He had been very active, Bardi, politically when he came back from... He was the preceding MP, I should have said that, sorry. He was the MP for the constituency before he became a Duke. And there was a very big land debate at that time that he took a very active part in. A lot of criticism of the landed gentry, landed aristocrats, especially by Lloyd George. Sorry. And he came to Blair later, and Bardi put Lloyd George on a pony and took him up Glentilt, over Ben Sherreg, into the Taff, with a group of working men from Glasgow, Dundee and Edinburgh that he had assembled, and said, if any of you want small holdings, I will give you one. And they all said, no, we want to go back to Glasgow, Edinburgh and Dundee. So he was quite smart about it. A lot of what was said, to give him his due, he was a bit like Kitty. He then went and looked through the rentals at Blair, and there are drawings of his numbers of settlements in Glentilt, because there were books written that there were thousands of clearances out of the Atholl lands. And he refuted that because there were the rentals from the 17th, 18th century with the numbers of people when they weren't doctored, that they were wanting as many people to pay the rent as they could. And they could see that there were never those numbers in Glentilt to be cleared. So he was a politician as well, but never really got involved again once she did. Handed over.
Did they ever actually manage to solve their financial difficulties?
Nope. Do you want a brief resume of that? Right, so, no, Bardi went on losing the money. So by 1930, the final denouement was the Wall Street crash, because they rented a lot of land to Americans. They rented the castle and the prime shooting and stalking, and they withdrew. So they basically went bust. He was in an embarrassing position of chairing the bank. So he retired. And they would have foreclosed, like on many estates, like on Breadalbyn. It wouldn't have been unusual. But because they had no children, which was fundamental, he had a younger brother who had become Duke who wasn't married. So there was no immediate heir, and you have to go a long way back and then come a long way down. And the heir to the dukedom was a Tony Murray, who was married to Angela Cowdrey. And the Cowdreys had a lot of money. And they realised that their member of their family, it was actually the twin of the Lord Cowdrey, would never become Duke if they didn't step in. So they offered to pay off the bank debt, which Bardi accepted with alacrity. The problem was, he said, oh yes, and this is the bank debt. He didn't say, this is the estate debt at this bank, this is the debt at the next bank, this is the Atholl Steel Houses debt, this is the Jamaica Sugar Corporation debt, etc., etc. So instead of paying 50,000, they paid about 350, which in those, if you can do a bit of conversion, if there's a maths among you. In 1930, it was a lot of money. So they paid off, the Cowdrey family paid off the debt in the hope that the heir and their Angela Cowdrey would succeed to the estate. And everybody then carried on as if nothing had happened. The Cowdreys were a lot more adept at finances than Bardi, and they realised that once somebody was used to spending like he was, there was a bit of an issue. So they turned it into a company, gave him the ordinary shares, and she kept the preference shares. So he found he couldn't spend any more money. He then died, as I said, in 1942. His younger brother died slightly later. What was extremely tragic was that the heir, Tony Murray, was killed during the Second World War, the last week of the war in Italy, 23rd of April 1945. But the Cowdreys were up for this. Angela, his widow, came to Blair with their young son, and she applied proper management to the Atholl estates for the first time in centuries, and she came and ran the estate. And there's a lot of people remember her, the Duchess and Mrs. Campbell Preston as she became, Mrs. Murray as she was then, were the two ladies that people on the estate remember. They remember the Duchess as an old lady, and they remember very clearly Angela Murray, who remarried and became Mrs. Campbell Preston. And she really turned the estate round. She instituted severe economies, but so the family as well. They paid for their shooting, they paid for their residence in the castle, which obviously the others never had. Heavens, what was your question? Sorry. So that's how the finances turned out. They needed to be rescued and were.
Maybe have a final question?
Wondered what age was she when she died? When did she die?
She died in 1960, and she was born in 1874, so she was sort of old. 80 something. Thank you. So people do remember her. In her old age, she gave out lots of school prizes still, and lots of people in the area don't remember her in a lot of depth, but they remember this very genial presence and words. You know, if they went and received their school prize in Blair Atholl, Logirate or Dunkeld, these words of encouragement from the Duchess.
So I think we'll draw the formal question session to an end just now, but please do come down and have a look. We've got a couple of books and obituaries here for you to have a look at on your way past. And as I mentioned, we've got the new Abertay Historical Society publication available for collection or sale as well. And we will see you all back in January, hopefully.